Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Andrew Taylor. I work for the Endangered Wildlife Trust as part of our Wildlife and Trade program. And before we get started, as with previous Wild Chats, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to answer or respond at the end of the talk. Okay, so I'm just going to quit my camera. So thank you. So this Wild Chat is about a study we finished at the end of 2019, which was looking at the roles and impacts of conservation NGOs in South Africa. And before kicking off, I'd just like to thank the Hans Hoherhausen Charitable Trust, which is managed by Ned Bank, for funding the work. Hans Hoherhausen is a very strong supporter of the EWT and very generously funds a number of our projects. So we're grateful to them for that. So the question I'm really trying to answer this morning is, what good are conservation NGOs? Why should you support us, and what value do we bring to society? EWT, like many other NGOs, have many loyal supporters, but as a sector, we do face questions about what we do with the money we're given. And it is fair for you to ask how we spend your money and how it contributes to the greater conservation effort. In a world of increasing environmental threats, but dwindling financial resources, donors do need to know that they are getting maximum impact from their support. And this is particularly important now with the global economic crisis brought about by the coronavirus. And of course, this doesn't only apply to the biodiversity conservation work that we do as a sector, but also to our contributions towards society through job creation, skills development, and other things like that. So we're facing many serious environmental threats, as the ones listed on the screen, but there are others as well. And as a sector, we obviously believe that NGOs played a very important role in reducing these threats, or trying to mitigate them at the very least. But our contributions have not really been well documented historically. So while most organizations have annual reports, and you can easily find these if you go to our websites, these do not provide the bigger picture of what our sector does as a whole. So if you wish to see what NGOs are doing as on a specific issue, but sort of as the wider sector, there is actually no resource you can easily tap into to find out. So the main purpose of the assessment was to conduct a preliminary analysis of the collective contributions of a subset of NGOs to biodiversity conservation in South Africa. We also intended to assess our contributions to things like job creation, skills development, and also public education. The review itself is intended to provide a synthesis of our collective work and was not done for comparative purpose. So in other words, it's not meant to be a competition between the NGOs that took part, because we all have slightly different mandates and different approaches, and there's varying sizes of NGOs as well. So I'm going to take a little time now just to explain how we went about this assessment so that you can understand why we focused on the issues we chose and why we selected the NGOs that we included. Conservation is a broad field because of the many threats to the natural environment. So we decided to focus in on biodiversity conservation. We do, of course, recognize the importance of the many other threats, such as climate change, depletion of natural resources, pollution, and waste, amongst others. But we didn't try to capture them all in a single review. That would have been too much of an effort, too big an amount of work to do. And because we set fairly narrow scope, and because we were only able to include a subset of NGOs in the review, we do acknowledge that our findings don't fully capture the work of the entire conservation sector, or the entire NGO sector. But the point is that this is the first such assessment that we're aware of for South African conservation NGOs. And we would like to repeat the process in a refined format with a larger number of participating organizations. So in deciding which biodiversity conservation issues to focus on, we chose or decided to use the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which is generally referred to by its acronym NBSAP, and I'll probably, when I refer to it again, I'll use the term NBSAP. And we use this as our key guideline document. And as a signatory to the Convention on Biodiversity, the South African government developed this strategy to identify the priorities for biodiversity management in South Africa. And so that's why we decided to use this as our guidelines for what we would measure. We broke down biodiversity conservation work into three main categories, all of which overlap to some extent with each other. And in many cases, if you're working on one, you could also be working on the other, or even all three at the same time. And these were habitat conservation, species conservation, and people and conservation. You could refer to that as community conservation as well. So defining what constitutes a biodiversity conservation NGO is slightly contested terrain. As mentioned earlier, there are many NGOs that work in this space in South Africa, and the numbers are increasing all the time. And many of them do very good work. But it would be a very large task to try to quantify the work of all of them in one review. So we started with a subsample. And to be as objective as possible, we chose NGOs that are members of the IUCN, so that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we did that because obtaining membership of the IUCN requires quite rigorous compliance with specific conservation and governance requirements. But I would like to just emphasize that this doesn't mean that IUCN members are better in any way. It's just that we needed our approach to be consistent, and we needed a good rationale to back up our choice of organizations. There are a lot of other NGOs out there doing very valuable work, including some of the very large and well-known ones that we weren't able to include in this study. And we would hope that we might be able to include them in a later study, but that's something that we would need to work on. So these are the 13 NGOs that participated in the assessment with us. And we're very grateful for the time that they took to do so, because it was quite an onerous process for them to fill in the surveys that we sent out. And just like to say, as I carry on with the talk, if I'm referring to we at all, then I'm talking to these 13 NGOs altogether, and I'm not just referring to the EWT. And just finally, to provide an independent oversight and a guidance to this whole process, we established a small advisory committee of non-NGO conservation experts to review the project from start to finish. So that was almost like a peer review process to try and reduce bias. So to get the information we needed, we developed survey questionnaires to find out how NGOs set conservation priorities, to look at the types of programmatic work that they do, and that was the sort of the biggest part of the work itself. What indicators they use to measure conservation success, which is becoming more and more important in conservation science. And if we want to use our money wisely and efficiently, we really need to measure our successes and have indicators for these. And also what the levels of income and spending are or were for the NGOs, and how many people they employ. And just FYI, the period under review was the financial year of 2017 and 18. There are some instances where we have a longer time period, but I'll talk about those if we do. So before talking about the actual conservation work we do, the sort of direct conservation work, I'll give you some basic statistics around how much money we bring in, how we spend it, and how many people we employ. So the total income for 12 of the NGOs, I didn't get the income from all 13. The total income for that 1 year financial period was 499 million Rand, just under R500 million. And this came from 11 types of funding source, which includes donations, trusts and foundations, government grants, corporates, also our own revenue generation, and a number of others. 74% of this income came from South African funding sources, and 26 came from international sources. In terms of how the money is spent, an average of 79% goes towards, or during the time period went towards, direct program costs. In other words, project expenses. So that includes salaries, of course, because conservation work is done by people and you can't do conservation without people's time. And the remaining 21% went towards support costs. So you might also refer to that as overheads or administrative costs. And regarding expenditure on different types of conservation work, about 35% went towards species conservation, about 34% towards habitat conservation, and 31% towards people and community conservation. That does vary between NGOs, but so those figures I've given you there are just averages. Okay, so employment, in terms of this, the total number of permanent staff in the 13 participating NGOs at the end of June 2018 was 962. So that's 962 jobs created by these small number of NGOs, of course, of quite variable sizes, with an additional 1,656 short-term contract workers, many of whom are paid for through government schemes, but are managed by NGOs. And these contract workers are quite or highly variable between years. So moving on to the programmatic work, I'll start with the stuff that has direct societal benefits. The South African government is currently implementing what they call the National Biodiversity Economy strategy, which is an initiative aimed at growing businesses and economic activities that either directly depend on biodiversity for their core businesses or that contribute to the conservation of biodiversity through their activities. So I'm not, and I should say that for the other programmatic work that I talk about, I'm not going to go into any great detail. You can, if any of you are interested in the detail of this, you can read our full report, and I'll give you the link of that, the link to that at the very end of the talk. But there's just isn't time to go through all now, and it'll also be incredibly boring to listen to as well. So, but some of the contributions in terms of the biodiversity economy rather. So supporting 13, and of course these are just in 1 year, and these do not include everything that was done by the different NGOs. Supporting 13 SMMEs and 15 cooperative businesses, ecotourism or associated services, which would include things like gardens feeding into ecotourism lodges, maintenance support to ecotourism lodges, such like. Planting of 120 homestead gardens and 12 school gardens. And again, remember, this is just in 1 year. The NGO that does most of this work has done thousands of these homestead gardens over the last decade. Included supporting 7 farmers organizations and 600 members who are using sustainable livestock production. Supporting 240 beehives in 8 communities and 2 separate regions. Okay, so then another area of societal benefit, public engagement. So many members of the public are not really aware of the impacts that their actions can have on the environment or the actions that they can take to reduce their impacts and conserve biodiversity. So one of the things we try to do is enhance people's awareness and understanding and appreciation of the diverse values of biodiversity, and also to mobilize them to make choices and take actions that enhance conservation. This kind of work includes raising awareness about the importance of conservation, education in schools, citizen science, which is basically the involvement of general public who can contribute towards foundational knowledge, which is something else I'll talk about later. Informing people about their environmental rights and also promoting conservation-friendly lifestyles. Some of the contributions that you can find in the report. So we have ongoing engagement with traditional authorities to support and promote benefit sharing and the green economy. Ongoing work with commercial farmers to secure safe space for threatened species. Engaging with 4,500 members of the public in annual National Awareness Day for frog conservation, providing more than 2,000 children with environmental education, engaging with 140,000 children in arts projects, and establishing recycling collection points in 130 schools and 90 businesses. So again, those are just a few of the contributions there. One of the key strategic areas under the NBSAP calls for the development of an equitable and suitably skilled workforce to improve conservation and management of biodiversity. And a key to achieving this, of course, is through training, and NGOs are very well placed to either develop and present relevant training interventions or facilitate such training. So not only does a skilled workforce improve the outcomes of conservation work, but it also improves the likelihood of obtaining jobs for the trainees and therefore their livelihoods as well. And 8 of the participating NGOs conduct some form of training. Of course, one of them, Wildlife Colleges, this is the main job that they do. And some of the findings, so during the 1 year, nearly 3,000 people completed SAQA accredited courses, just over 5,000 completing non-SAQA accredited courses. And there are many types of training with very broad categories. So these including things like conservation farming, green learning for sustainable livelihoods, project skills development, nature conservation and field ranger training, conservation management, poison intervention training, coastal zone management and fishery and fish identification. Just a few among many. So then moving on to more sort of direct, what we might think of as more direct conservation work, starting with habitat conservation. Protecting space and conserving habitat is, of course, one of the best ways to conserve biodiversity. And from a protected areas perspective, there are 3 main mechanisms with which to expand the terrestrial protected area network. These include acquisition of land, contract agreements, things like biodiversity stewardship, and also declaration of state or public land. Now, the first and third I won't talk about. So acquisition of land through purchase is a kind of a more traditional option that involves buying land to add to the existing protected area network or create new ones. And this is being done more and more by private landowners or by NGOs. And there are just over 1,000 hectares was added in that financial year. In terms of declaration of state or public land, this is the way that most PAs were created historically, but this is a very expensive option. And there isn't so much land available nowadays, which is already under state land. So I'll talk a little bit about biodiversity stewardship. A number of NGOs are involved with this. And of course, there are a number of NGOs that play very important roles in biodiversity stewardship that did not participate in the review. And hopefully we can bring them in future iterations of the review if we decide that it's worthwhile doing that. And of course, if we bring them in, then we will have a much greater idea of the extent to which this happens. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, biodiversity stewardship is a form of contractual agreement and is a mechanism for provincial conservation authorities to secure land in high biodiversity value for conservation through voluntary agreements with private or communal or municipal landowners. And then these are made possible through national legislation, whereby the landowner signs a formal contract and agrees to certain restrictions on land use, but the landowner retains ownership and derives certain benefits, not the least of which is in helping to improve biodiversity conservation. So this process is actually led by provincial conservation authorities, and so it's not led by NGOs. But the declaration of new protected areas is generally or almost always the result of collaborative work between provinces and third parties, which would include NGOs. And there are many combinations of partnerships are possible, which does make it difficult to quantify the contributions of the different parties. And so since 2011, the total terrestrial area declared under biodiversity stewardship was over 1 million hectares, but those with the assistance of the participating NGOs was 385,000 hectares. And in the time period in which we're talking about, sorry, that says 2019, so that should be 2018, NGOs assisted with the declaration of nearly 21,000 hectares. And there are still over 600,000 hectares of land under negotiation as well, which includes, which will include the facilitation help from NGOs. Marine protected areas. So 2 of our participating NGOs work in this area. So before 2019, South Africa had 23 inshore marine protected areas within what's known as the Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ, covering an area of about just under 500,000 hectares. But this only covered about 0.4% of the available area. And under the CBD, the aim would be to get at least 10% of this area protected. And during 2019, a further 20 inshore MPAs, or marine protected areas, were declared, which added just over 4.5 million hectares, which brings the percentage area in the EEZ up to 5%. And as I mentioned, 2 of the participating NGOs played pivotal roles in this process. Of course, the government is the driver of this, but the roles of the NGOs here included things like advocacy and policy development, lobbying the government to raise awareness around MPAs and the need to protect this area, and building a case for MPAs to assist government in their development. Another role also was to conduct original research to determine where the MPAs should be placed. So these are critical roles that NGOs have played in this massive increase in area under marine protected areas. Some of our participating NGOs also play a role in transfrontier conservation areas. And of course, one of them, Peace Parks, this is the biggest role that they play, and they're a huge player in this. They are the driver of this whole process. South Africa has 6 transfrontier conservation areas within its borders, or spanning its borders, I should say. And there are another 12 outside of South Africa, which we did not include in our review. Now, in the period of review, there were no additions to the area within the South African transfrontier areas, but there is constant work going on in these areas, in these established ones, to keep them functioning effectively, because these are all in different stages of development. And so 4 of the participating NGOs play a role in this, with varying sort of minor to major roles, but a huge amount of ongoing work in transfrontier conservation areas. So moving on to species conservation, South Africa is of course a mega diverse country because it has very high levels of biodiversity and endemism. But much of our diversity is at risk. So 17% of our mammals, 15% birds, 9% of the reptiles, and 15% of our amphibians are listed as regionally threatened on the IUCN Red List, threatened species. And so one of the key features of the NDSAP again is the sound management of our biodiversity. So we need to do something about these species that are threatened, and also we need to prevent species from going onto this list. 8 of our participating NGOs work on species conservation at some level, either directly or indirectly, because in some cases their main focus might be on habitat, but there are spin-offs for species. Some of the key findings, so the wild dog managed metapopulation remains stable. Safe space for wild dogs has grown over the last few years. Genetic diversity is good. We had 37 cheetah relocations over the period, of which 74% were considered successful, which means that the animal survived for 2 years post-release. 58 reserves now nationwide, private reserves now nationwide, have actively involved cheetah managed metapopulations, sorry. Another example is wattle cranes. So number of wattle cranes is now up 60% over the last quarter century. Breeding pairs up 40%. And a lot of that has to do with the contributions of NGOs. ex situ conservation. So this is conservation of biological diversity outside their natural habitats, and generally involves maintenance of endangered species and breeding of endangered species under controlled conditions in places like zoos and nurseries. So this provides a backup strategy and added security for highly threatened species when there is concern that more standard conservation methods may not be adequate. And so a couple of key findings. 600 Pickersgill reed frogs, which is a critically endangered species, were bred in captivity, and 250 of those were released back into the wild. 2 captive reared wattled cranes, which is a threatened species, were successfully reared and released back into the wild. And there's a program of breeding seahorses as well, which is making good progress. Okay, so wildlife trade. So this is something I talked about a few weeks ago. But in terms of what our NGOs are doing for this, so the government generally takes the lead on stopping illegal wildlife trade, but it has insufficient capacity to do this alone. So conservation NGOs have taken a very big role in this over the last few years. And again, there are many NGOs that play a role in this and that were not included in our assessment. So we'd like to just recognize their inputs as well, although they weren't measured in our study. But also I should say it's not easy to measure the impact of our work in this arena because there are many organizations involved and because there are many different interventions being implemented at the same time. So we have government and national parks, law enforcement, South African police force and NGOs, private nature conservation areas, all doing their part to try to reduce the impacts. So it becomes very difficult to actually tease apart who's doing what and sort of assign credit, if you will, to the different NGOs. So what we tend to do more here is measure whether an activity is implemented rather than whether the ultimate goal was achieved. So for example, it's quite easy to count the number of rhinos that are dehorned, but it's much harder to assess whether that dehorning actually reduces poaching, which is the long-term goal, which is what you need to try and measure. So this is something that we need as a sector to improve on in the future. We need to invest more time in assessing which strategies are most impactful for wildlife populations. But I should also say that we need to remember the counterfactual argument that suggests that without our interventions, the situation would be far worse. So some of the key findings: there were no rhino poaching incidents in 25 private reserves in KZN during the time period that were assisted by our participating NGOs, while there was some poaching in other reserves in KZN. We deployed between us 13 detection dogs in reserves. We funded the dehorning of 24 community rhinos. We funded the feasibility trials testing whether giant pouched rats, so that's in the bottom left of your screen, whether these rats could be used to detect pangolin scales in hardwood, and the findings were extremely positive in terms of their ability to do this work. The next step will, of course, be to try and implement these, send these out, operationalize, I think I should say, in the field and see if we can actually get them working. We assisted with the development and testing and deployment of a number of technologies to assist with intelligence-led investigations. We reached out to over 1 million people in Vietnam through social media campaigns on the use of rhino horn, although here this is another area where it's very difficult to actually measure impact. And we brought together South African, Chinese, and Vietnamese agencies to allow for interagency fact-finding and collaboration. And again, when I'm saying we, I'm talking about our group of 13 NGOs as a whole. So we also work on knowledge, getting knowledge, foundational knowledge, and monitoring of wildlife populations, research into the basic biology and ecology of species and the distributions and population trends may not directly conserve species or boost numbers, but it's a critical part of the process of understanding the impacts of threats to conservation, and is frequently a necessary part of a species conservation strategy. So some of the sort of key results. So one of our NGOs tested the efficacy of ear notching in black rhinos, and they found that it wasn't a particularly effective method to identify animals in the thick bush. We've looked at the distribution and activity patterns of riverine rabbits, which is a critically endangered species, and we really need to know more about it to conserve it. There's been work done on the migration biology of humpback whales. And then there's general ecology and conservation work on species of cranes and amphibians and marine invertebrates, all of which need a lot of research. And then in terms of monitoring, we have a number of NGOs that focus a lot on monitoring. And this has included things like annual surveys of Oribi populations, successes of wild dog reintroductions, or monitoring the successes, I should say, of wild dog reintroductions, interactions with humans, human-wildlife conflict mitigation, disease management, monitoring the success of cheetah translocations and how they respond to reintroductions to sites and how they come into conflict with humans, conducting annual KZN leopard surveys to understand population trends, human-wildlife conflict, understand whether or not hunting quotas can be set, population dynamics and poisoning events in African vultures and other birds of prey. Vultures in particular are under very serious threat from poisoning, and we really have to understand this issue a lot better. Movement patterns and breeding behavior of southern ground hornbills, another threatened bird, amongst many other things. Okay, so just to finish off, to mention something about measuring impact. So, and as I mentioned earlier, it's quite difficult to measure impact as an NGO. And there are a number of reasons for this. So the goals of conservation work can take a long time to accomplish. So you can set a project going for, say, 3 years, but you may only actually see impact after 5 years. And so then how do you actually report back on the successes of your work? So you have to end up measuring just implementation of projects. Many of the large-scale projects that we work on require collaborations. We can't do them on our own. We're either working with government, or we're working with the private sector, or we're working with other NGOs. And that makes it difficult to tease apart who's actually doing what. And so you can't necessarily ascribe your work to a success. So a classic case would be rhino poaching and trying to reduce rhino poaching. You know, the government, sandparks, provincial parks, SAPS, Department of Environmental Affairs, private landowners, private rhino owners, NGOs are all working on this. And we think we are seeing some benefits. And of course, without this work, we would have no rhinos left. But how do you determine which work being done is actually having the most impact? So setting indicators can be very challenging as well. And in some cases, some of the work that we do is actually quite intangible. So, you know, a lot of, you know, it involves, and this doesn't just go for NGOs, but there's a lot of sort of interacting with people, attending meetings, workshops, which are all really important in terms of planning of projects and to make them successful, but it's very difficult to measure that. How do you determine whether 10 meetings actually had any impact on anything? So what we found when we were looking at this is that pretty much all projects measure implementation of projects. So were we successful in terms of, did we dehorn 20 rhinos as we planned to? Did we give 20 vehicles to provincial parks? So that's very easily measured, and we do that. But when it comes to sort of intermediate conservation outcomes or measuring that, only 70% of projects measure the intermediate conservation outcome. So this would be how a project affects the conservation problem of interest. And then when you then move up the next stage, so measuring conservation impact, if we implemented a program of training anti-poaching field rangers, did that actually impact on the rhino poaching crisis itself? Did it lead to a reduction in poaching and an increase in the wild populations? And only 43% of projects measure the long-term conservation impact. So this is something that, as a sector, we really need to do a bit better. And it's something that we can work on, and as time progresses, funding organizations are actually looking for us to tell them how we're going to measure these things more and more. Okay, so that comes to the end of the talk. As I mentioned, the full report can be found at the link indicated here. We do also have a much shorter report, which we sort of refer to as a policy for decision makers, which we can also, if you would like to see that, I can send you the link for that if you send me an email. But if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to share them and I'll try to answer. Okay, sorry, I wasn't finding the points. Okay, so the first is from Alistair Stalker. Sand Parks, Esenvelo and Northwest Parks are going to suffer massive revenue losses because of COVID-19. Government will have no additional funds to support them. Do you think that NGOs will be able to play a greater role in carrying out critical conservation activities? So yes, so that's a very unfortunate outcome of the coronavirus situation, is that there's far fewer funds available for conservation, and sort of state-funded nature conservation and protected areas were already under stress because of the growing pressures for government to sort of shuffle funding to other areas. And now that sort of global economy has been really significantly affected, it's almost inevitable that funding will drop off. So I agree completely. And I think there is definitely room for us to step up and help if we can. Of course, there is a chance in some areas that NGOs might also feel a pinch of funding as well, because we brought in 2018, we brought in 500 million rand. There's no guarantee that that kind of money will be available to us in 6 months' time or a year's time. But there is opportunity for us to step in and help. I mean, we do, between us organizations, we do work a lot with Sand Parks and with Esenvelo and with Northwest Parks, just to name a few. It does, of course, require sort of some trust and transparency between us, between the government parks and NGOs, to be able to do this. But I think we will need to work more closely together and see how we can work together and try to keep things in contact, in touch. Okay, so Knowledge says, dehorning rhino means a relative increase in the demand. So maybe an increase in the price of the horn in the illicit trade. Is it safe to make it a trial when there is risk of worsening poaching on the threatened species? So, okay, so dehorning rhinos in this case primarily is done in an attempt to reduce poaching. So you can dehorn a rhino, as you will know, you can dehorn a rhino without harming the rhino. You have to immobilize it, which there is a risk to doing that, but my understanding is it's a very low risk, especially if it's a white rhino in controlled conditions. The risks are now very low. You have to immobilize it, you cut the horn off, and if you do it properly and you follow and you sort of learn from other people's mistakes, you don't damage the growth point of the horn. The rhino is not harmed, the horn grows back. But the purpose in many cases has been to try to reduce the amount of poaching. So if a rhino doesn't have a horn, theoretically, it's less of a target for a poacher. So if I'm going around poaching stuff and I see a rhino without a horn, I'm less likely to poach it. Now, of course, some dehorned rhinos are poached, and we can debate the reason for that happening. It could simply be because the poacher hasn't seen that the rhino is dehorned. It could also be because the poacher doesn't want to have to try to maybe track that animal again, waste his time or her time. But whether or not dehorning is actually an effective anti-poaching tool is questionable. I think the likely answer is that if you combine dehorning with a very solid anti-poaching campaign, and you also sort of raise awareness in the area that you have dehorned your rhinos, and if you dehorn all of your rhinos, the dehorning will probably play some kind of role in reducing poaching. But it doesn't work completely. But in terms of dehorning for trade, so domestic trade is legal. It's been legal for a couple of years since the moratorium was lifted. the local domestic moratorium on selling rhino horn. And it's, you know, I don't really know what the size of the market is within South Africa. Theoretically, it's very, very low. We don't really have any uses for rhino horn in South Africa. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be speculators who would want to buy it for later on. But in terms of international trade, that's currently not allowed. CITES does not allow that. Rhinos, black rhino is Appendix 1, the white rhino is Appendix 2, but his horn is under Appendix 1. So trading for mostly commercial purposes is not allowed, internationally speaking. So the dehorning that I'm referring to is not, or should not be going towards horn that would be traded. So because there is no international trade allowed. So I don't think it's really going to be increasing the demand at the moment. Now, if that was to change, then I guess the answer to your question might be a little bit different. So let me just read it again. It means a relative increase in demand. So maybe an increase in the price of the horn and the illicit trade. Maybe I've totally misunderstood your question, sorry. I guess, I don't know if maybe what you mean by that is if we're dehorning rhinos and they are not poached, then the remaining rhinos with the horns might be more valuable. I'm not sure if that's what you mean. Is it safe to make it a trial when there is a risk of worsening? So yeah, I don't know that, I think to answer, if I'm understanding you correctly, I don't think that it would necessarily increase the demand. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. I'd need to give that some more thought. And that's never something that's come up in terms of, you know, the question of should we dehorn a rhino? Because of course there could also be impacts on the ecology of the animal as well. So I don't think so, but I would need to give that a bit more thought. Robert Mann says there are a large number of non-IUCN registered NGOs, predominantly funded by international volunteers, operating on private land with little governance on the work they conduct. How do you think accountability for such organizations could be improved? Would the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals be applicable and made mandatory for such non-IUCN registered NGOs? Well, so I think that would come down to how one registers an NGO. This is not something that I understand at all, although I do work for an NGO. I'd have to, the best person to answer this would probably be our CEO, Johan Friedman, because you know, she has a really in-depth understanding of how NGOs work and how they're set up. So she could potentially give a better answer here. Sorry, the question's moving. But yes, it is true that there are a lot of non-IUCN registered NGOs out there, and we don't necessarily know what they're all doing. I think, to be fair, I think many of them have very good intentions. Many of them are doing good work and important work, but it's also possible that some of them are working on things that are not helping and could be making things worse. In terms of accountability, this would potentially have to be changed by how NGOs are set up. And I think that's really beyond my knowledge. Maybe the process in which this is done could be more rigorous. And if it's done sort of under conservation, for conservation purposes, maybe somebody could be set up to actually monitor this as well. Would the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals be applicable? So they could be. Could they be made mandatory? I'm afraid I don't know if that's possible legally under what sort of legislation NGOs fall under. Karina Becker says, this is a statement, COVID could reduce international funding and volunteers cannot travel to South Africa. An example is SANCOG, who relies on volunteers and funding from international zoos. So yes, very true. International volunteers, that's something I hadn't even been thinking about in terms of COVID. So that's a very good point. It also, of course, has a huge impact on the number of tourists coming to the country, which massively reduces the income. So Kruger National Park has in the region of 2 million visitors a year. A large proportion of those are foreign visitors, spend a huge amount of money. Their income is going to decline massively. The private wildlife ranching sector is really seriously feeling the pinch of a decline in tourism. because whether it's hunting tourism or non-consumptive tourism, tourists pay 70 to 80% of their income, so they're really struggling. So it's not, the NGO sector as well is also going to be hit. And yes, unfortunately, all NGOs that rely on volunteers are going to be affected heavily, and our funding could be affected as well. Okay, sorry, I missed one. Eleanor Mary Cadell. Why is trade in rhino horn legal locally? Surely this could allow poachers to kill rhinos for local trade and then somehow smuggle the horn overseas. So the local trade, to the best of my knowledge, is very, very small. You are allowed to trade rhino horn locally. You'd have to have all the relevant permits from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So you have to have a permit even just to have on your person, just to hold a rhino horn, you have to have that. To buy and sell, you have to have a permit. To transport, you have to have a permit. So you have to have, there are pretty rigorous permitting conditions on having rhino horn, and you would have to, and the government would know, if you're doing it legally, the government will know whether you bought the horn. And it's a good point that we don't really have local use for rhino horn at the moment. And so what is the purpose of it? I think, so there are a number of private rhino owners who believe that this is important for them to be able to generate revenues, which will then help them pay for protecting their rhinos. And I think the fact that they need money to protect their rhinos is a very valid point, and it's costing them a lot of money to do so. But whether or not having a local trade will help them with that is very questionable. And we did, if you're interested, EWT wrote a report which came out in 2014 on the feasibility of legalizing domestic trade, removing the moratorium. And our general finding was that there is no point in doing so. Could it allow poachers to kill for local trade and then somehow smuggle them overseas? I guess so. I think the difficulty with that is if you have a horn locally and it's legal, and your province is checking on you regularly, which they should be doing, then you would have to account for your lost rhino horn, and it would have to be audited. So, but whether that, I mean, if you poach a rhino, you can smuggle it overseas anyway. So I don't know that the local trade in rhino horn would necessarily affect that. I'd speak under correction there, so someone can correct me if they think I'm wrong. Okay, that looks like I think that's it. That's all the questions I seem to have here. Yes, okay, so that's all the questions. So I think, what time is it? So it's 10 to 12. So we'll close there. Thank you very much for listening. And as I said, you can find the full report on the link on this final page. Very welcome to email me on my andrewt@ewt.org.za if you'd like to follow up with any questions. Yeah, thanks very much.